The gunshot that shattered the Arizona dawn sent Thea, shepherd, running toward the one man the entire territory had learned to fear. It was June of 1872, and the high desert air still held the coolness of night as Thea stumbled through sagebrush and rock. Her split skirt catching on thorns, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind her, 3 days of running had left her exhausted, desperate, and out of options. The mining camp of Copper Ridge, where she'd sought refuge after fleeing her uncle's ranch, had proven no sanctuary at all. The men who worked for Silas Cord, her uncle's business partner, had found her there, and now they were closing in with orders to bring her back by any means necessary. She'd heard the stories about the Modoc warrior who lived in the foothills above the valley. The townspeople spoke his name, Chaveo, in hushed tones, always with a mixture of fear and grudging respect. They said he was a ghost, a shadow who could track a man across solid rock and disappear into thin air. They said he'd killed 3 claim jumpers single-handedly when they tried to poison the spring his people considered sacred. They said he'd once walked into the saloon in Copper Ridge, placed a bloodied knife on the bar, and told the owner that the next man who dumped mining waste into the northern creek would lose more than his knife. They said he trusted no white settlers and had vowed never to let another acre of his ancestral lands fall into greedy hands. Thea had no reason to seek his help and every reason to fear him. But desperation had a way of making impossible choices seem inevitable. The shot came again, closer this time, splintering bark from a juniper tree just ahead. She dove behind an outcropping of red sandstone, her heart hammering against her ribs. Her father's pocket watch, the only thing of value she'd managed to take when she fled, pressed against her chest through the fabric of her dress. She could hear men's voices now, crude and confident, discussing which direction she might have run. "She can't have gone far," one of them called out, his voice carrying through the morning air. "Cord wants her alive, but he didn't say she had to be unmarked. Said we could have a little fun with her if she gave us trouble." Rough laughter answered him, and Thea's stomach churned with revulsion and terror. She pressed her back against the sun-warmed stone, fighting down panic. Her hands were scraped and bleeding from her fall earlier that morning. Her dress was torn at the hem and stained with dust and sweat. She had no food, no water, and no weapon beyond a small folding knife that had been her father's. She'd grown up in San Francisco, the daughter of a shipping merchant who'd built his fortune on honest trade and fair dealings. When her father died suddenly 6 months ago, she'd discovered the truth buried in his papers. Her uncle, Marcus Shepherd, had been systematically embezzling from the family business for years. Worse, he'd forged documents making it appear that her father had approved a marriage contract between Thea and Silas Cord, a ruthless mine owner twice her age who'd helped Marcus hide his crimes in exchange for Thea's hand and a substantial share of the Shepherd shipping fortune. She'd confronted her uncle in his study, armed with the evidence she'd painstakingly gathered. Marcus had smiled, poured himself a brandy, and calmly explained that she had 2 choices. She could marry Silas Cord as agreed and live comfortably as his wife, or she could refuse, in which case he would see her committed to an asylum for hysteria and delusions. A fate he assured her would be far worse than any marriage. Thea had smiled back, told him she'd consider his generous offer, and fled that very night. The stagecoach west had seemed like salvation, a chance to reach the territorial marshal in Prescott with her evidence. But Marcus had anticipated her route, and Silas Cord's men had been waiting at every stop, now hiding in the wilderness with nowhere left to run. Thea made her decision. She broke from cover and ran uphill toward the dense pine forest that marked the beginning of Modoc territory. The men shouted behind her, and she heard the thunder of hooves as they spurred their horses forward. But the terrain grew rougher, rockier, and soon the sounds of pursuit fell back as the horses struggled with the steep grade. Thea pushed forward, branches whipping at her face as she plunged deeper into the trees. Her lungs burned, her legs trembled with exhaustion, but terror drove her on. She followed what might have been a game trail, winding between massive pines and over fallen logs slick with moss. The forest grew darker, cooler, and she could hear the distant sound of running water. The ground suddenly dropped away beneath her feet. She tumbled down a steep embankment, rolling through pine needles and loose rocks before splashing hard into a stream. The shock of cold water stole her breath. She lay there gasping, every part of her body aching, before survival instinct forced her to move. She struggled to sit up, water streaming from her hair and clothes. And that's when she heard it. "You run from men with guns." The voice came from directly above her, so quiet she almost missed it over the sound of rushing water. Thea's head snapped up, and she found herself staring at a man who seemed to have materialized from the forest itself. He stood on a flat rock overlooking the stream, perfectly still, his dark eyes assessing her with an intensity that made her feel stripped bare. He wore buckskin leggings and a vest over a cotton shirt, his long black hair tied back with a leather cord, decorated with small turquoise beads. A rifle rested easily in his hands, not pointed at her but ready, and a knife hung at his belt in a beaded sheath. His face was angular and striking, with high cheekbones and a strong jaw marked by a thin scar that ran from his left temple down to his jawline. Everything about him spoke of contained power, of absolute confidence in this wild place. Thea scrambled backward in the water, her hand instinctively reaching for the small knife she kept hidden in her boot. "Stay back," she said, her voice shaking despite her effort to sound firm. Her fingers fumbled with the knife, and she realized with dismay that the sheath was empty. She must have lost it during her fall. The man's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "You are on Modoc land," he said, his English accented but clear. "Those men who chase you, they will not follow here. They fear what waits in these mountains. Are you?" Thea swallowed hard. "Are you Cheveo?" He inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the name. "And you are the woman the town speaks of. The one who ran from the man who buys women like cattle." Heat flooded Thea's cheeks, whether from anger or shame she couldn't tell. "I'm not being bought. I never agreed to any marriage. My uncle forged my father's signature on a contract that has no legal standing. White man's law," Cheveo said, and there was something bitter in his tone. "It protects who it chooses to protect. Your uncle's friend, this cord. He owns the judge in Copper Ridge. He owns the sheriff, too." Thea's heart sank, though the information didn't surprise her. "Then I'll go further. I'll reach Prescott, or Santa Fe, or somewhere beyond his influence. You will die first," Cheveo said flatly. 3 days in the desert with no food, little water. You are already weak. I can see it in how you move. Another day, and the land will claim you, even if the men do not. Then what do you suggest?" The words came out sharper than she intended. "Should I just surrender? Let them drag me back to a man who'll lock me away or worse. I'd rather die out here, free, than live one day as his prisoner." Cheveo was quiet for a long moment, studying her with those unsettling dark eyes. Finally, he lowered his rifle. "Come out of the water. You need food and rest." Thea didn't move. Every instinct screamed at her to be cautious. She'd heard the stories, knew what some white women claimed happened to those who fell into the hands of natives. But she'd also heard other stories, about the arbitrary cruelty of men like Silas Cord. She'd learned that monsters came in all colors. "I'm scared of you," she said, the admission torn from her by exhaustion and honesty. Something changed in Cheveo's expression, a softening so brief she almost missed it. He took a deliberate step backward, then another, increasing the distance between them. "Then I will prove I am worth believing," he said quietly. "I will walk ahead. You will follow if you choose. There's a place nearby, safe and hidden. Food, water, shelter. I offer this freely, with no debt owed. Why?" Thea asked. "Why would you help me? Everyone says you hate white settlers. Chevio's jaw tightened. I do not hate people for the color of their skin. I hate thieves and liars, and those who break their word. I hate men who take what is not theirs and call it destiny. He paused, his gaze holding hers. My sister, she was taken by white traders when she was young. Sold to a man in California. By the time I found where they had taken her, she was already dead. Worked to death in his house. His voice remained even, but Thea could hear the controlled fury beneath. No one should be property. Not land, not water, not people. The raw pain in his words resonated with something deep inside Thea's chest. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry that happened to your sister. He shook his head slightly. Your sorrow changes nothing. But your choice now, it matters. You can trust that I speak truth, or you can stay in this stream until those men find you. They are perhaps 10 minutes behind. As if summoned by his words, a distant shout echoed through the forest. Thea looked at Chevio, at this feared warrior who had just shared his deepest pain with a stranger, who had stepped back when she admitted her fear and made her decision. She pulled herself from the water, her dress heavy and clinging, and nodded once. I'll follow, she said. Chevio turned without another word and began moving through the forest with impossible grace. He made no sound, left no obvious trail, moved as if he were part of the wilderness itself. Thea followed as best she could, acutely aware of every branch that snapped beneath her feet. Twice she stumbled badly, and twice he paused without looking back, waiting until she caught up before continuing. They climbed higher into the mountains, the air growing cooler and thinner. Thea's wet clothes chilled her skin, and she began to shiver uncontrollably. But she bit back any complaint, determined not to slow him down further. The terrain grew increasingly difficult, the slopes steeper, the rocks more treacherous. Chevio led her through a narrow gap between two massive boulders, then along a ridge that dropped away dizzily on one side. Finally, they reached a place so well hidden she would never have found it alone. A small canyon, invisible from below, sheltered a grove of ancient pines surrounding a crystal spring. At the far end, protected by an overhang of rock, a structure had been built into the cliff face. It looked like it might have been there for generations. Constructed from stone and timber that had weathered to match the surrounding rock. This was a winter camp for my grandfather's grandfather, Chevio said, speaking for the first time since they'd left the stream. Now it is mine when I need solitude. Few know of this place. He gestured toward the structure. Inside there is dry wood, blankets, supplies. You should change from those wet clothes before sickness takes hold. Thea hugged herself, suddenly aware of how violently she was shivering. I don't have anything else to wear. Chevio disappeared into the structure and emerged, a moment later with a soft buckskin dress and a heavy blanket woven in intricate patterns. My sisters, he said quietly, holding them out but not approaching too close. She would want them used by someone who needs them. Thea accepted the items with trembling hands, touched by the gesture. Thank you, she managed. I'll take care of them. He nodded toward the structure. Privacy is yours. I will prepare food. Inside the shelter, Thea found it surprisingly spacious and well-appointed. Woven mats covered the floor, and niches in the stone walls held carefully wrapped supplies. She peeled off her wet dress with difficulty and pulled on the buckskin dress, marveling at how soft it felt against her skin. She wrapped the blanket around her shoulders and stood for a moment, trying to process everything that had happened. This morning she'd been running for her life. Now she was wearing a dead woman's dress in a Modoc warrior's hidden camp, trusting her safety to a man the entire territory feared. The absurdity of it would have made her laugh if she weren't so exhausted. When she emerged, Chevio had a small fire burning and was roasting what looked like rabbit on a spit. The smell made Thea's stomach clench with hunger. He glanced at her briefly, then returned his attention to the fire. Sit, he said, indicating a flat rock near the flames. "Food will be ready soon." Thea sat, grateful for the fire's warmth. Cheveo worked in silence, his movements efficient and practiced. There was something almost meditative about watching him. "The men who chase you," he said finally. "How many?" "4 that I've seen," Thea replied. "There's Tucker, Cord's foreman. Then Walsh and Brennan, hired guns from Texas, and a tracker named Dawes. But Silas Cord has more men than that. He owns half the mining operations in the territory. I know of Cord," Cheveo said, his tone unfavorable. "He poisons creeks with his mining waste. 2 seasons ago, he tried to claim the spring south of here. Said he had government papers." He looked up, his eyes hard. "I burned his papers and sent his men running. That's why they fear you," Thea said softly. "They should fear what they do to the land," Cheveo replied. "But yes, they fear me also." He pulled the rabbit from the fire, tested it, then tore off a portion and handed it to her. "Eat slowly. Your stomach will rebel if you rush." The meat was tender and flavorful, seasoned with herbs she didn't recognize. Thea ate carefully, savoring each bite. Cheveo ate his own portion in measured bites. "You can stay here tonight," he said when they'd finished. "Tomorrow we decide what comes next." "What do you mean?" Thea asked. "Running is not a plan, only a delay. You need strategy, not just distance." He stood and began banking the fire. "Rest now. You are safe in this place. I give you my word. Where will you sleep?" The question sounded more intimate than she'd intended. "Outside," Cheveo said simply. "Under the stars. It is my preference." He paused. "You feared me in the stream. That fear is not gone. Having walls between us while you sleep, it is better. Trust must be earned." Thea felt shame at her own prejudice. "I'm sorry for assuming the worst." "You've been nothing but kind." Cheveo's expression softened slightly. "Suspicion keeps you alive. Do not apologize for surviving." He moved toward the entrance. "But perhaps tomorrow there will be less fear. Trust must be built slowly, like a fire, one piece at a time." After he left, Thea lay down on the pallet of blankets and furs. Her body ached with exhaustion, but her mind refused to quiet. She thought about her father, about the life she'd expected. The society parties and suitable marriages that now seemed like someone else's dream. And she thought about Cheveo, the feared warrior who had stepped back when she admitted her fear, who had shared his sister's story and offered help with no conditions. In one day, he'd challenged everything she thought she knew about strength and honor. Outside, she could hear him settling in for the night. Despite everything, despite the danger still lurking below and the uncertain future ahead, Thea felt safer than she had in months. For the first time since her father's death, she felt like someone saw her as a person rather than property to be acquired. She pulled the blanket closer and let exhaustion finally claim her. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions. But tonight, in this hidden place that time seemed to have forgotten, she would rest. Thea woke to the sound of birdsong and the gentle murmur of the spring. Sunlight filtering through the pine branches in golden shafts. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was, and panic seized her chest. Then the events of the previous day came flooding back. The chase, the fall into the stream, Cheveo's unexpected offer of sanctuary. She sat up slowly, her body stiff and sore from yesterday's ordeal, and wrapped the blanket around her shoulders. The shelter felt peaceful in the morning light, safe in a way she hadn't experienced since her father's death. She could hear movement outside, the soft crackle of a fire being tended, and the smell of something cooking drifted through the entrance. Her stomach growled in response, reminding her that one meal after 3 days of near starvation wasn't nearly enough. She stood and smoothed down the buckskin dress, running her fingers over the intricate beadwork. Whoever Cheveo's sister had been, she'd possessed remarkable skill and patience. Each tiny bead was perfectly placed, forming patterns that seemed to tell a story Thea couldn't quite read. She took a deep breath, steadying herself, and stepped outside. Cheveo was crouched by the fire, turning what looked like flatbread on a hot stone. He'd changed his shirt to a lighter cotton one, and his hair hung loose around his shoulders, black and glossy in the morning sun. He glanced up as she approached, his expression neutral but not unwelcoming. "You slept well," he said. It wasn't a question. "Better than I have in weeks," Thea admitted, settling onto the same rock she'd occupied the night before. "Thank you for letting me stay." He handed her a piece of the flatbread, still warm, along with some dried berries from a leather pouch. "Eat, then we talk about what you will do." Thea ate slowly, savoring the simple food. The bread was slightly sweet, made with some kind of ground nuts mixed into the flour, and the berries were tart and refreshing. As she ate, she studied Cheveo, trying to reconcile the feared warrior of town gossip with the man who sat across from her, patiently cooking breakfast and offering help to a stranger. "You said yesterday that running isn't the plan," she said finally. "What did you mean?" Cheveo poured water from a clay vessel into 2 wooden cups and handed her one. "Your uncle and this cord, they have money and men. You have neither. If you keep running, eventually their resources will outlast your strength. They will find you in Prescott or Santa Fe or wherever you go. Men like that, they do not give up what they believe belongs to them. Then what do I do?" Thea asked, frustration creeping into her voice. "I can't fight them. I have no weapons, no allies, no proof that would stand up in a court they control." "You said your uncle forged documents," Cheveo said, his dark eyes studying her. "Where are the real ones? Where is the proof of what your father actually wanted?" Thea's hand instinctively went to her bodice, feeling the shape of her father's pocket watch beneath the buckskin. "My father kept meticulous records. Everything was documented, every transaction, every contract. His personal papers are still in our San Francisco house, locked in his study. But my uncle controls that house now. I'd never get inside." "Perhaps not alone," Cheveo said thoughtfully. He stood and walked to the edge of the canyon, looking out over the valley below. "But there are ways to make powerful men vulnerable. Ways to turn their strength against them." Thea joined him at the overlook, following his gaze. From this height, she could see for miles, the rolling hills covered in pine and juniper, the distant glint of the river winding through the valley. "What are you suggesting?" "Cord is here, in Arizona, yes? Searching for you with his men?" "Yes," Thea confirmed. "He came himself when I escaped. My uncle sent word, and Cord brought 12 men to track me down." A slow smile crossed Cheveo's face, and for the first time, Thea saw something dangerous in his expression. "Then his minds are less protected than usual. His attention is divided. And men who are distracted make mistakes. I don't understand," Thea said, though a flutter of hope stirred in her chest. "Cord's power comes from his wealth, yes? And his wealth comes from the mines. Silver, mostly some copper." Cheveo turned to face her fully. What if his mines had problems? What if equipment broke, shipments were delayed, operations were disrupted? What if he had to choose between chasing you and protecting his fortune? Thea's eyes widened as she understood what he was proposing. "You want to sabotage his operations. I want to give you leverage," Cheveo corrected. "Right now, you have nothing to bargain with. But if Cord is losing money, losing face with his investors and partners, he becomes desperate. Desperate men make deals they would not otherwise consider. That's incredibly dangerous," Thea said, even as part of her thrilled at the boldness of the plan. "You could be killed. And if you're caught, they'll hang you for sabotage or worse." Cheveo's expression hardened. "They would have to catch me first. And I have been making Cord's life difficult for 2 years now. This would simply be more of the same, but with purpose beyond protecting the land. Why would you risk so much for me?" Thea asked, searching his face. You don't know me. You owe me nothing." He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. "When my sister was taken, I was away hunting. For 3 days. When I returned, she was already gone, sold and transported, before I even knew to look for her. I spent 2 years searching, following rumors and trails that led nowhere. By the time I found the truth, she had been dead for 6 months." His jaw clenched. "I swore then that if I ever had the chance to help someone escape that fate, I would not hesitate. I would not be too late again." The raw emotion in his words made Thea's throat tight. She reached out without thinking and placed her hand on his arm. He stiffened slightly at the contact but didn't pull away. "I'm sorry you carry that burden. But my fight isn't your responsibility." "Perhaps not," Cheveo said, looking down at her hand on his arm, then back to her face. "But I choose to make it so. Unless you would rather face this alone." Thea withdrew her hand slowly, suddenly aware of the intimacy of the gesture. "No," she said softly. "I wouldn't rather face it alone. If you're truly willing to help, I accept. But I won't let you take all the risk. Whatever we do together." Something shifted in Cheveo's expression, a respect she hadn't seen there before. "You are braver than you know, Thea Shepherd." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and hearing it in his accented English sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. "I'm terrified," she admitted. "But I'm tired of running, tired of being afraid. My father taught me that when you're pushed into a corner, you either curl up and wait for the end, or you come out fighting." "Your father sounds like he was a wise man," Cheveo said. "He was," Thea agreed, blinking back sudden tears. "He built his business on integrity. He believed in fair dealing, in keeping your word, in treating people with dignity regardless of their station. My uncle destroyed all of that. Corrupted everything my father built." Cheveo nodded slowly. "Then we will make sure his corruption does not stand. But first, we need information. I must know which of Cord's mines are most vulnerable, which of his men remain to guard them, what routes his ore shipments take." He turned back toward the shelter. "I have contacts, other Modoc who work in the territory, who see and hear things the white men think they hide. I will send word, gather what we need to know. How long will that take?" Thea asked, following him. 2 days, perhaps 3. "In the meantime, you will stay here where you are safe. The men who chased you yesterday, they will not venture into these mountains. They fear what they do not understand. And what about you?" Thea asked, concern sharpening her voice. "If you leave this canyon, if Cord's men see you, they will not see me," Cheveo said with quiet confidence. "I have moved through this territory for years without being seen when I choose not to be. I am smoke, shadow, nothing more." Despite his confidence, Thea felt uneasy about him leaving. In less than a day, this stranger had become her only ally, her only hope. "Be careful," she said. "Please," he paused, studying her face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "You worry for me." "Yes," Thea said simply. "Is that so surprising?" "Most white women would not," he replied. "Most would be relieved to see me go, even if it meant being alone again." "I'm not most white women," Thea said, meeting his gaze steadily. "And you're not the savage the town makes you out to be. You're a man who honors his word and protects those who need help. That's more than I can say for most of the so-called civilized men I've known." Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding that transcended the differences in their backgrounds. Cheveo inclined his head slightly, acknowledging her words, then moved to gather his weapons and supplies. "There is food stored in the shelter," he said, checking his rifle and securing his knife. "Water from the spring is pure. You can bathe there if you wish. The pool is deep enough and private. I will return before sunset tomorrow at the latest." "And if you don't return?" Thea asked, voicing the fear that gnawed at her. Cheveo met her eyes. "Then you wait one more day." If I have not returned by the second sunset, you take the trail that leads northwest from this canyon. Follow it for half a day, and you will reach a settlement called Pine Haven. Ask for a woman named Sarah Whitmore. Tell her Chevio sent you. She will help you reach Prescott safely. You've thought of everything, Thea said, trying to smile despite the anxiety coiling in her stomach. Survival requires planning, he said. Then, unexpectedly, he reached out and touched her shoulder briefly, a gesture of reassurance. I will return, Thea. You have my word. Before she could respond, he turned and disappeared into the forest with that same impossible silence. Leaving her alone in the hidden canyon, the day stretched long before her.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Thea explored the canyon more thoroughly, discovering it was larger than she'd first thought. The spring fed into a small pool that sparkled in the dappled sunlight, surrounded by smooth stones perfect for sitting. Ancient pictographs decorated one section of the cliff face, faded images of animals and hunters and symbols she couldn't interpret. She wondered how many generations of Chevio's people had used this place. How many stories these rocks could tell. She did bathe in the pool, the water cold but refreshing, washing away the grime and fear of the past days. Afterward, she laid her borrowed dress on a sun-warmed rock to air and sat wrapped in the blanket, letting her hair dry. For the first time in months, she felt almost peaceful, despite the danger that still lurked beyond this hidden sanctuary. As the afternoon wore on, Thea's thoughts kept returning to Chevio. She found herself analyzing everything he'd said and done, trying to understand this complex man who'd risked so much for a stranger. The pain he carried over his sister's death was palpable, a grief that had shaped him into who he was. She recognized that kind of formative loss because she carried her own. Her father's death had shattered the foundation of her world, forcing her to see clearly for the first time how fragile safety could be. But there was something more than shared grief drawing her to Chevio. It was the way he moved with absolute certainty in his environment, the quiet confidence that needed no boasting. It was the respect he'd shown her, even when she'd admitted her fear, the way he'd stepped back rather than pressing his advantage. It was the intelligence in his eyes and the careful consideration he gave before speaking. In her world, men talked endlessly, filling silence with their own importance. Chevio spoke only when he had something worth saying. She realized with a start that she was thinking about him far more than was appropriate or wise. He was helping her escape a terrible fate, nothing more. Any feelings beyond gratitude were just her mind seeking comfort in a terrifying situation. Yet even as she told herself this, she knew it wasn't entirely true. There was an attraction there, undeniable and growing, that had nothing to do with gratitude. As evening approached, Thea prepared a simple meal from the supplies in the shelter. She found dried meat, more of the ground nut flour, honey stored in a clay pot, and various roots and herbs she couldn't identify. She made a stew of sorts, hoping she'd combine the ingredients correctly, and ate while watching the sun set over the valley. The sky turned brilliant shades of orange and pink, and the temperature dropped quickly once the sun disappeared. She retreated to the shelter as darkness fell, building up the fire and wrapping herself in blankets. The night sounds of the forest surrounded her, hooting owls, rustling leaves, the distant cry of a coyote. Without Chevio's presence nearby, she felt more vulnerable, jumping at every unexpected noise. But exhaustion eventually claimed her, and she slept fitfully, dreaming of shadowy figures and gunshots that never quite found their target. The next day passed much like the first, though Thea felt increasingly restless. She practiced walking quietly through the forest as she'd seen Chevio do, with predictably poor results. She examined the pictographs more closely, tracing the faded lines with her fingers. She tried to imagine the people who'd created them, wondered if they'd faced challenges as daunting as her own. By late afternoon, she found herself constantly watching the canyon entrance, looking for any sign of Chevio's return. The sun began its descent, painting the sky in vibrant colors again, and still he didn't appear. Thea tried to tamp down her worry, reminding herself that he'd said he might not return until the second day. But as twilight deepened into night, her anxiety grew. She built up the fire and sat beside it, staring into the flames. What if something had happened to him? What if Cord's men had spotted him despite his confidence? What if she never saw him again, never had the chance to truly thank him for his kindness? The thought sent a sharp pain through her chest that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with the confusing feelings she'd been trying to ignore. "You worry too much," a voice said from the darkness, and Thea nearly jumped out of her skin. Chevio emerged from the shadows at the canyon entrance. Moving so silently, she hadn't heard his approach despite listening intently for hours. Relief flooded through her so powerfully that she found herself standing and taking several steps toward him before she could stop herself. "You're back," she said, her voice embarrassingly breathless. "I said I would return," Chevio replied. But there was something pleased in his expression, as if her obvious relief touched him. He carried a leather satchel over one shoulder and his rifle in his other hand. "I have information." "Good information. You scared me half to death," Thea said, pressing a hand to her racing heart. "I didn't hear you coming at all." "I know," he said, a hint of amusement in his voice. "I heard you moving around the fire, muttering to yourself about foolish warriors and unnecessary risks." Heat flooded Thea's cheeks. "You were listening to me?" "I was making sure the camp was safe before approaching." "You happened to be talking." He moved to the fire and set down his satchel. "It is good that you worried. It means you understand the danger we face." Thea sat back down, trying to compose herself. "Did you find what you needed?" Chevio settled across from her and began removing items from his satchel. He spread out what looked like a roughly drawn map, marking it with stones to hold it flat. "Cord has 3 major operations in this territory. The largest is the Silver Crown Mine, 20 miles south of here. It employs 40 men and produces most of his wealth. The second is the Copper Ridge operation, smaller but still profitable. The third is a new claim he just opened, barely staffed, mostly exploratory." He pointed to marks on the map. "The Silver Crown is too well guarded, even with Cord himself away. But the Copper Ridge mine, it has vulnerabilities. The main shaft support timbers are old, the equipment is poorly maintained. And the foreman, a man named Hutchins, he drinks heavily and pays little attention to safety. An accident there would not seem suspicious." "An accident," Thea repeated, understanding his implication. "You want to collapse part of the mine, not collapse," Chevio corrected. "That would kill workers, and I will not have innocent blood on my hands. But damage the main pump system, the one that keeps water from flooding the lower shafts. It would take weeks to repair, weeks of lost production. Cord would lose thousands of dollars, and his investors would start asking difficult questions." Thea studied the map, her mind racing. "And while he's dealing with that crisis, he'd have less time and fewer resources to chase me." "Exactly," Chevio said. "But there is more. I learned that your uncle has been sending telegrams from Copper Ridge to San Francisco, to someone named Harrison Blackwell. Does that name mean anything to you?" Thea's blood ran cold. "Harrison Blackwell is my father's former attorney. He handled all the business contracts and legal matters. If my uncle is corresponding with him, it means he's probably trying to make the forged documents look legitimate, creating a false paper trail. Then time is critical," Chevio said. "Once those false documents are properly filed and recorded, proving fraud becomes much harder. We need to act soon." "How soon?" Thea asked. "Tomorrow night," Chevio said. "The pump system at Copper Ridge is housed in a separate building, easier to access without being seen. I can disable it in less than an hour. We can disable it, Thea corrected firmly. I told you, I won't let you take all the risk. Caveo shook his head. It is too dangerous. If something goes wrong, you'll need someone watching your back, Thea interrupted. I may not know this land like you do, but I can keep watch. I can warn you if someone approaches. 2 pairs of eyes are better than 1. They stared at each other across the fire, a battle of wills playing out in silence. Finally, Caveo sighed. You are stubborn. I prefer determined, Thea said, allowing herself a small smile. Do we have an agreement? Against my better judgment, yes, Caveo said. But you follow my lead exactly. No improvisation, no heroics. If I say run, you run. Understood? Understood, Thea agreed. Caveo began explaining the plan in detail, using the map to show her the layout of the mine, where guards were typically posted, the best approach routes. Thea listened intently, committing every detail to memory. As he spoke, she found herself watching the way firelight played across his features, highlighting the strong lines of his face, the intensity in his dark eyes. She forced her attention back to the plan. Tomorrow night, everything would change. They would strike the first real blow against Silas Cord's empire, and either gain the leverage she needed or paint targets on both their backs. The thought should have terrified her, and part of it did. But another part, the part that had been awakened by days of running and fighting for survival, thrilled at the prospect of finally fighting back. You should rest, Caveo said when he'd finished the briefing. Tomorrow will be a long day, and tomorrow night even longer. What about you? Thea asked. I will keep watch for a while, then sleep. Old habits from the war. He stood and moved to add more wood to the fire. Sleep, Thea. We will need all our strength. She wanted to protest, to stay up and talk more, to learn more about this enigmatic man who'd become so important to her so quickly. But exhaustion and common sense prevailed. She retreated to the shelter, wrapped herself in blankets, and tried to quiet her racing mind as she drifted toward sleep. Her last conscious thought was of Caveo sitting by the fire, keeping watch, keeping her safe. Tomorrow they would step fully into danger together. But tonight, in this hidden canyon beneath the stars, she felt safer than she had any right to feel. The moon hung low and blood-red on the horizon as Thea and Caveo approached the Copper Ridge mine under cover of darkness. They'd left the hidden canyon hours earlier, moving swiftly through terrain that would have been impossible for Thea to navigate alone. Caveo had painted dark streaks across both their faces with ash and clay, making them nearly invisible in the moonlight. And Thea wore a pair of buckskin leggings and a dark shirt he'd produced from his supplies. Practical clothes that allowed her to move silently. The mine sat in a narrow valley, surrounded by piles of tailings and excavated rock that gleamed pale in the darkness. A handful of lanterns marked the main buildings, including the pump house that was their target. Thea could hear the distant thump of machinery, the constant rhythm of the pump that kept the lower shafts from flooding. 2 guards stood near the main shaft entrance, smoking cigarettes and talking in low voices, their rifles propped against the building beside them. Caveo touched her arm and pointed to a rocky outcropping about 200 yards from the pump house. They made their way there in absolute silence, Thea stepping exactly where Caveo stepped, matching his careful movements. Once behind the rocks, he pulled her down into a crouch and pointed out the details of the layout. The pump house is there, he whispered, his breath warm against her ear. 1 guard makes rounds every 30 minutes. He just passed 5 minutes ago, so we have 25 minutes before he returns. The door has a simple lock. I can open it in seconds. What about those 2 by the main shaft? Thea asked, keeping her voice equally low. They face away from the pump house. As long as we stay in the shadows and move when they are looking elsewhere, they will not see us. He studied the scene carefully. When I move, you count to 10, then follow. Stay low, use the equipment for cover. If anything goes wrong, if I signal like this," he made a quick gesture with his hand, "you run back the way we came. Do not wait for me, Chevio." Thea started to protest. "Promise me," he said, his dark eyes boring into hers with an intensity that stole her breath. "If I am caught, you must escape. You must reach Prescott and expose what your uncle has done. That is more important than my life." Thea wanted to argue, wanted to refuse to leave him behind under any circumstances, but she saw the determination in his face and knew he wouldn't proceed unless she agreed. "I promise," she said. Though the words tasted like ash, Chevio nodded once, satisfied. He checked his knife, made sure his small leather tool pouch was secure at his belt, then squeezed her hand briefly. "Stay alert. Stay alive." Then he was moving, flowing across the open ground like a shadow, so fluid and silent that Thea almost lost sight of him despite knowing where to look. She counted slowly to 10, her heart hammering so hard she was certain the guards would hear it. At 10, she followed, mimicking his crouched run, using a broken ore cart for cover, then a stack of timbers. Finally pressing herself against the wall of a storage shed 20 feet from the pump house. Chevio was already at the pump house door. Working on the lock with tools she couldn't see clearly in the darkness. The steady thump-thump-thump of the pump covered any small sounds he might have made. Thea watched the guards by the main shaft, holding her breath every time one of them moved or turned. They seemed bored, unconcerned, more interested in their conversation than in watching for intruders. The pump house door opened with a barely audible creak. Chevio slipped inside and gestured for Thea to follow. She crossed the final distance quickly and ducked through the door, which he closed softly behind her. The interior was lit by a single lantern hanging from a hook, casting dancing shadows across the machinery. The pump itself was a massive contraption of iron and wood, pistons rising and falling in steady rhythm, driving water up from the depths below. "Watch the door," Chevio whispered, already moving to examine the pump mechanism. "If you see the guard returning early, tap twice on the wall." Thea positioned herself near the door, finding a gap in the boards that gave her a view of the area outside. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the rough wood, adrenaline making every sense hyper-aware. She could smell the grease and oil from the machinery, hear the squeak of metal on metal, feel the vibration of the pump through the floorboards. Behind her, Chevio worked with quiet efficiency. She risked a glance back and saw him removing the critical gear from the pump assembly, replacing it with one that looked similar, but had been deliberately damaged. He worked quickly but carefully, his hands steady and sure. This wasn't sabotage meant to cause immediate catastrophic failure, she realized. This was sabotage designed to look like mechanical failure after hours of operation, something that would be blamed on poor maintenance rather than deliberate action. "How much longer?" she whispered. 5 minutes, he replied, not looking up from his work. Thea turned back to her surveillance. The two guards were still talking, one of them laughing at something the other had said. The mine was quiet otherwise, most of the workers having retired to the bunkhouse for the night. Only a skeleton crew remained, and they were all underground or in the processing building on the far side of the complex. Then she saw movement that made her blood run cold. A third guard, one they hadn't accounted for, was walking toward the pump house with purposeful strides. He carried a lantern in one hand and a rifle in the other, and he was less than 100 feet away. "Chevio," she hissed urgently, tapping twice on the wall as he'd instructed. Guard coming, not the regular one, someone else. Chevio was beside her in an instant, peering through the gap. His jaw tightened as he assessed the situation. He is coming to check the pump. This building, it is his responsibility. He pulled Thea away from the door, looking around the small structure for options. Up there, he pointed to the rafters, barely visible in the darkness above the lantern's light. Quickly, there was no time to question or argue. Cheveo boosted Thea up, and she grabbed the rough-hewn beam, pulling herself into the rafters with strength born of desperation. Cheveo followed with fluid grace, settling onto a beam beside her just as the door began to open. They pressed themselves flat against the timbers, hardly daring to breathe. The guard entered, whistling tunelessly. He hung his lantern on the hook beside the existing one, flooding the space with more light. Thea's heart pounded so loudly she was certain he would hear it. The man walked directly to the pump, running his hands over the mechanism, checking gauges and connections. He was thorough, methodical, taking his time. Then he paused, frowning. His hand hovered over the section where Cheveo had made the replacement. Thea felt Cheveo tense beside her, his hand moving slowly toward his knife. The guard bent closer, examining the gear assembly with suspicious eyes. "Johnson!" A voice called from outside. "You in the pump house?" The guard straightened, irritation crossing his face. "Yeah, what?" "Hutchins wants you at the main office. Something about tomorrow's shift assignments." The guard muttered something unflattering about Hutchins and his shift assignments, gave the pump one last cursory glance, then headed for the door. He grabbed his lantern, plunging the space back into relative darkness, and left. They heard his footsteps fading, followed by his voice arguing with whoever had summoned him. Thea released a shaky breath, her whole body trembling with relief. Cheveo touched her arm gently, signaling her to remain still and quiet. They waited in the rafters for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes. Making sure the guard wasn't returning, finally, Cheveo lowered himself silently from the rafters and helped Thea down. Her legs nearly buckled when her feet hit the floor, adrenaline and fear catching up with her. Cheveo steadied her, his hands strong on her shoulders. "Are you hurt?" he asked quietly. "No," she managed, though her voice shook. "Just terrified." "You did well," he said, and the approval in his voice steadied her more than his hands on her shoulders. "You stayed calm, stayed quiet. That guard, he almost discovered what I had done. If you had panicked, we would both be caught. Is the sabotage complete?" Thea asked. "Yes. The modified gear will fail within 12 hours, maybe less. The pump will seize, and water will flood the lower tunnels. No one will be hurt. The workers will have time to evacuate, but the damage will take weeks to repair." He moved to the door, checking outside carefully. "We need to leave now, before that guard returns, or before someone else decides to check the pump." They slipped out of the pump house, and Cheveo relocked the door behind them, making it appear as though no one had been there. The return journey to the rocky outcropping was faster, both of them moving with increased urgency. Once they were safely behind the rocks, Cheveo didn't stop but continued moving away from the mine, putting distance between them and the site of their crime. They traveled for over an hour before Cheveo finally called a halt near a small stream. Thea collapsed onto a fallen log, her legs shaking from exertion and delayed fear. Cheveo knelt by the stream, washing the ash and clay from his face, then brought her water cupped in his hands. "Drink," he said. "You need it." Thea drank gratefully, the cold water shocking her system back to alertness. When she'd finished, Cheveo wet a cloth and gently cleaned the camouflage from her face, his touch surprisingly tender. In the moonlight, with his face so close to hers, Thea was acutely aware of every detail, the slight stubble on his jaw, the way his eyes crinkled slightly at the corners, the small scar that marked his temple. "Thank you," she said softly, meaning more than just the water and the cloth. "You risked much tonight," Cheveo replied, settling beside her on the log but maintaining a respectful distance. "More than you should have." "That guard, if he had looked up, but he didn't," Thea interrupted. "We succeeded. We struck back at Cord, just like you planned, the first strike," Cheveo corrected. "This will hurt him, but it will not stop him. It will, however, divide his attention and his resources. When news of the pump failure reaches him, he will have to make choices about where to focus his energy. And while he's making those choices, I can make my move, Thea said, understanding dawning. But what move? I still can't get into my father's house in San Francisco to retrieve the real documents. Chevalier was quiet for a moment, thinking. There may be another way. You said this attorney, Harrison Blackwell, he handled your father's legal matters? Yes, for over 15 years. My father trusted him completely. Then he would have copies of the real documents, yes? Attorneys keep such records. Hope flared in Thea's chest. Of course. Harrison would have copies of everything. The original contracts, my father's will, all of it. But how do I get him to give them to me? My uncle has probably already gotten to him. Convinced him I'm unstable or lying. Perhaps, Chevalier said. Or perhaps this attorney is an honest man who would want to know the truth. You said your father trusted him. That trust must have been earned somehow. It was, Thea confirmed, remembering the kind older gentleman who had always treated her with respect and courtesy. Harrison Blackwell is old-fashioned, principled. He once turned down a very lucrative client because the man wanted him to draft contracts that were technically legal but morally questionable. My father admired him greatly for that. Then we send him a message, Chevalier said. We tell him what your uncle has done, ask him to examine his records and compare them with whatever your uncle has sent him. If he is truly principled, he will investigate. And if he finds discrepancies, he will have questions your uncle cannot easily answer. But how do we get a message to him? The telegraph office in Copper Ridge is controlled by Cord's people. They'll read anything I send. There are other telegraph offices, Chevalier said. Pine Haven has one 40 miles north. The operator there, she is honest. She will not report to Cord. I have used her services before when I needed to send warnings to other settlements about mining operations that threatened their water supplies. Thea's mind raced with possibilities. If I can reach Pine Haven, send a telegram to Harrison explaining everything. Ask him to investigate and to contact the territorial marshal if he finds evidence of fraud. That would expose your location, Chevalier warned. Once the telegram is sent, Cord will know where you were. You would have perhaps 2 days before his men arrived. 2 days to get to Prescott, Thea said. It's possible, isn't it? If we ride hard? Possible, yes. But difficult and dangerous. The terrain between Pine Haven and Prescott is rough. And there are men in that territory who would sell information about a woman traveling alone. Then I won't be traveling alone, Thea said, meeting his eyes directly. You'll be with me. Something passed between them in that moment. An acknowledgement of how much had changed in just a few short days. They were no longer stranger and refugee, but partners in a dangerous game, bound together by shared purpose and growing trust. And underneath that, unspoken but increasingly impossible to ignore, was an attraction that had nothing to do with circumstance and everything to do with genuine connection. I will be with you, Chevalier confirmed, his voice carrying a weight of commitment that went beyond mere words. Until you are safe, until your uncle and Cord face justice, I will be with you. Why? Thea asked again, the question that had haunted her since that first day. Why are you doing all of this? Is it truly just about your sister, about being too late to save her? Chevalier looked away, staring out into the darkness. At first, yes. When I found you in the stream, running and afraid, I saw her. I saw the chance to do what I could not do before. He paused, seeming to struggle with something. But it is no longer just about her. It is about you, Thea. About who you are, what you represent. What do I represent? She asked softly. Courage, he said simply. You could have surrendered, could have accepted the fate your uncle planned for you. Many would have. But you chose to fight, to risk everything for your freedom. That takes strength that I admire. He turned back to face her. And you have shown me something I had forgotten. That not all white settlers are the same, that some share the values I hold, believe in the same ideas of justice and honor. You've shown me something too, Thea admitted. You've shown me that strength doesn't require cruelty, that power can be used to protect rather than dominate. You've treated me with more respect and kindness than men who claim to be gentlemen ever did. They sat in comfortable silence for a while. The only sounds the gentle burble of the stream and the night songs of insects.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
Thea found herself hyper-aware of Chevio's presence beside her, the solid warmth of him, the steady rhythm of his breathing. She wanted to close the distance between them, to lean against his shoulder and feel the comfort of human contact. But she held back, uncertain of whether such a gesture would be welcome. We should return to the canyon, Chevio said eventually, though he made no move to stand. Dawn is still hours away, but the journey back will take time. Can we rest here for a few minutes more? Thea asked. I don't think my legs are quite ready to carry me another mile just yet. A ghost of a smile crossed Chevio's face. A few minutes more. Those few minutes stretched into 20, neither of them willing to break the peaceful moment. They talked quietly about inconsequential things, Chevio describing the different plants that grew in the high desert and their uses, Thea sharing stories about her childhood in San Francisco. It felt surreal to be sitting beside a stream in the middle of the Arizona wilderness, having just committed sabotage against a mining operation, discussing the fog that rolled through the Golden Gate on summer mornings. I would like to see San Francisco someday, Chevio said thoughtfully. To see the ocean, the great ships your father worked with. I have only known rivers and lakes. It's beautiful, Thea said. Chaotic and crowded, but beautiful in its own way. The bay at sunset, with dozens of ships at anchor and the hills rising behind them. My father used to take me to the dock sometimes, let me watch the cargo being loaded and unloaded. He said it was important to understand where wealth came from, to see the labor and risk involved in trade. He taught you to respect work, Chevio observed. That is a good lesson. He taught me many good lessons, Thea said, her throat tightening with grief. I just wish he'd lived long enough to teach me how to protect what he built. I feel so inadequate, like I'm failing him. You are not failing him, Chevio said firmly. You are fighting for what he believed in, even though the cost is high. That is not failure. That is honor. His words wrapped around her like a warm blanket, easing the guilt and fear she'd been carrying. On impulse, Thea reached out and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. She felt him stiffen slightly in surprise, but he didn't pull away. Instead, after a moment, he squeezed her hand gently. Thea, he said, his voice carrying a note of warning. You should know that what you feel now, it may be just gratitude or fear seeking comfort. When this is over, when you are safe and your life returns to normal, you may see me differently. I am not part of your world, and you are not part of mine. What if I don't want my old world back? Thea asked, surprising herself with the question. What if I've learned that world was built on comfortable lies and polite cruelty? What if I want something real instead? Chevio studied her face in the moonlight, searching for something. Real is harder, he said quietly. Real means facing difficult truths, making impossible choices. Real means being rejected by both our peoples for choosing each other. I know, Thea said. But at least it would be true. At least it would be chosen, not forced upon me. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Chevio lifted their joined hands and pressed his lips briefly to her knuckles, a gesture that was both tender and restrained. When this is over, he said, when you are safe and free to make choices without fear clouding your judgment, ask me again. If you still want something real, I will give you an honest answer. It wasn't a rejection, but it wasn't acceptance either. It was, Thea realized, Exactly what she should have expected from a man who valued truth and careful consideration over impulsive action. And somehow, that restraint made her feelings for him even stronger. "We should go," Cheveo said, releasing her hand and standing. "The night grows late, and we have much to plan." Thea stood as well, her legs steadier now. As they began the journey back to the hidden canyon, she found herself stealing glances at Cheveo's profile, memorizing the strong lines of his face. Tomorrow they would begin the next phase of their plan, the dangerous journey to Pine Haven and then to Prescott. But tonight, for a few precious hours, she had felt truly seen and valued by someone who asked nothing of her except honesty. The sky was beginning to lighten with pre-dawn gray when they finally reached the canyon. Exhaustion pulled at Thea, but her mind was too active for immediate sleep. They shared a quick meal of dried meat and water. Then Cheveo insisted she rest while he kept watch. "Tomorrow we prepare for the journey north," he said. "You will need your strength." Thea retreated to the shelter, but sleep was elusive. Her mind replayed the night's events, the fear in the pump house, the conversation by the stream, the feel of Cheveo's hand in hers. She'd crossed so many lines in the past few days, committed crimes, trusted a stranger, admitted feelings she barely understood herself. The proper San Francisco girl she'd been was gone, replaced by someone harder, braver, more honest about what she wanted from life. And what she wanted, she was beginning to realize, wasn't just freedom from Silas Cord. It was the right to choose her own path, to build a life based on her own values rather than society's expectations. And increasingly, that path seemed to lead toward a quiet Modoc warrior who treated her like an equal and made her feel truly alive for the first time in her life. The news of the Copper Ridge pump failure reached them 2 days later through one of Cheveo's contacts, a Modoc tracker named Taka, who brought supplies and information to the hidden canyon. The sabotage had worked even better than planned. The pump had seized completely during the night shift, flooding 3 of the lower tunnels before workers could evacuate. No one had been killed, but the damage was extensive, and Silas Cord had reportedly arrived at the site in a towering rage, threatening everyone from the foreman to the equipment suppliers. "He has pulled half his men from the search for you," Taka reported, speaking in rapid Modoc that Cheveo translated for Thea. "They are now guarding his other operations, afraid of more sabotage. The town is talking of nothing else. Some say it was equipment failure, others whisper of deliberate attack. Cord suspects the Modoc has offered a reward for information about who might have done this. How much time do we have before he connects this to Thea's disappearance?" Cheveo asked. Taka shrugged. "He is angry, not thinking clearly. But he is not stupid. Eventually he will wonder at the timing. A few days, perhaps a week before he realizes this was not random." After Taka left, Cheveo and Thea spent the afternoon preparing for their journey to Pine Haven. Cheveo checked and rechecked their supplies, his movements precise and methodical. Thea watched him work, noting the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened when he thought she wasn't looking. "You're worried," she observed. "The journey to Pine Haven is dangerous enough," Cheveo said, not looking up from the leather pack he was organizing. "But what comes after, the ride to Prescott, that is where the real risk lies. Cord will have men watching the roads, checking every settlement. Once we send that telegram, we will have very little time. Then we'll have to be faster than they are," Thea said with more confidence than she felt. "We've come this far. We can make it the rest of the way." Cheveo finally looked at her, his dark eyes searching her face. "You have changed since I found you in that stream. You were afraid then, running blindly. Now you face danger with clear eyes. I had a good teacher," Thea said softly. "You've shown me that fear doesn't mean weakness. That courage is choosing to act despite being terrified." Something shifted in Cheveo's expression, a warmth that transformed his usually guarded features. He crossed to where she stood and took both her hands in his. "Thea Shepherd," he said, his voice low and serious, "when this is over, when you are safe in Prescott with the law protecting you, I need you to think carefully about what comes next." "What do you mean?" she asked, though her heart was already racing. "I mean that the life I lead, it is not easy. I have few possessions, no permanent home. I move where the land and my people need me. I face danger regularly from men who see me as an obstacle to their greed. Any woman who chooses to be with me would face hardship, prejudice, danger." His grip on her hands tightened slightly. "But if you still want something real when this is finished, if you still want to choose your own path, I will be waiting. I will give you that honest answer I promised." Thea's breath caught in her throat. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" "I am saying that I have come to care for you in ways I did not expect, in ways I tried to prevent," Cheveo admitted. "You are brave and strong and honest. You see me as a man, not as the savage the townspeople fear. That is rare and precious. But I will not ask you to choose this life while you are still in danger, while gratitude might cloud your judgment. When you are truly free, then we will speak of this again." Before Thea could respond, before she could tell him that her feelings had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with genuine connection, he released her hands and stepped back. "We leave at dawn tomorrow," he said, his tone becoming businesslike again. "Sleep now. The journey will be long." That night, Thea lay awake in the shelter, replaying their conversation in her mind. Cheveo had essentially offered her a future with him, but only after making sure she understood the cost. It was so characteristic of him, putting her well-being and freedom of choice above his own desires. Any other man would have pressed his advantage, taken what he could get while she was vulnerable and dependent on him. But Cheveo held back, protecting her even from himself. The realization made her feelings crystallize into certainty. She didn't just admire him or feel grateful to him. She loved him. Loved his strength and his gentleness, his fierce protection of what he held sacred, his careful consideration before speaking or acting. She loved how he made her feel seen and valued as a person, not as property or prize. And she loved that he was willing to wait, to let her choose freely rather than claiming her when she had no other options. Dawn came too quickly. They broke camp efficiently, Cheveo making sure all traces of their presence were erased. If anyone stumbled upon this canyon, they would find no evidence that it had sheltered fugitives. They set out as the sun painted the eastern sky in shades of gold and crimson. Heading north through terrain that grew increasingly rugged, the journey to Pine Haven took 2 full days of hard riding. They avoided established trails, instead following paths that only someone with Cheveo's knowledge of the land could navigate. They saw no one, which was both a relief and a source of tension. The emptiness meant they were unobserved, but it also meant they were far from any help if trouble found them. They rode mostly in silence, both conserving energy and staying alert for any signs of danger. But during their brief rest stops, they talked. Cheveo told her stories of his childhood, of learning to hunt and track from his grandfather, of the old ways that were slowly disappearing as white settlement expanded. Thea shared memories of her father, of the principles he'd tried to instill in her, of the business he built through honest dealing in a world that often rewarded deception. "Your father and my grandfather would have understood each other," Cheveo observed during one such stop. "Both believed that a man's word was his bond, that honor mattered more than wealth. It's a dying philosophy," Thea said sadly. "Men like my uncle and Silas Cord are the future. They take what they want and use the law to justify their theft. Perhaps," Cheveo said. "Or perhaps there are more people like you and me than we realize. People who still believe in the old values, who are willing to fight for what is right, even when it costs them dearly. We are not as alone as we think." They reached Pine Haven in the late afternoon of the second day. The settlement was smaller than Copper Ridge, just a handful of buildings clustered around a central square. A general store, a small hotel, a stable, and the telegraph office. Cheveo left Thea hidden in a grove of trees outside town while he scouted the area, making sure none of Cord's men were present. He returned 20 minutes later with good news. The town is quiet. I spoke with the telegraph operator, Sarah Whitmore. She remembers me. We'll send your message without reporting it to anyone. But we must be quick. Once the telegram is sent, we have no more than 48 hours before Cord learns of it. They entered the town separately, Cheveo first and Thea following 10 minutes later, both taking care to appear casual and unhurried. The telegraph office was a small room attached to the general store, operated by a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who looked up when Thea entered. "You're the one Cheveo told me about," Sarah Whitmore said without preamble. "The girl running from Silas Cord." "Yes, ma'am," Thea confirmed, glancing around nervously. "I need to send a telegram to San Francisco," Cheveo explained the situation. "Write your message there." Sarah pushed paper and pencil across the counter. "I'll send it, but understand this. Once that message goes out, you need to be far from here. Cord has people everywhere, and telegraph operators talk. I can keep quiet, but I can't control what happens at the other end." Thea nodded and began composing her message, choosing each word carefully. The telegram needed to convey urgency while providing enough information for Harrison Blackwell to take action. She wrote and rewrote several times before finally settling on the text. Harrison Blackwell, attorney, San Francisco. Stop Marcus. Shepard forged father's signature on marriage contract and business. Documents. Stop request you examine your files. Compare. With documents Marcus sent. Stop. I have evidence of embezzlement and fraud. Stop. Contact Territorial Marshal Prescott immediately. Stop. My life in danger. Stop. Thea Shepard. She handed the message to Sarah, who read it quickly and nodded. "This will cost you $5. Thea pulled out the last of her money, counting out the exact amount. Sarah took it and began tapping out the message on the telegraph key, the clicks filling the small room with urgent rhythm. When she finished, she looked up at Thea with something like sympathy in her eyes. "You're brave, girl. Braver than most. Whatever happens, you hold on to that." She paused. "Cheveo is a good man. Harsh sometimes, but good. You could do worse than having him on your side." "Thank you," Thea said, meaning it sincerely. "For everything." She left the telegraph office and found Cheveo waiting with fresh supplies and 2 rested horses he'd acquired from his contact in town. They mounted quickly and rode out, heading east toward Prescott, leaving Pine Haven behind as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. The first day of riding was uneventful. They pushed hard, covering nearly 40 miles before making camp in a sheltered canyon. Cheveo was tense, constantly scanning their surroundings, his hand never far from his rifle. Thea understood his vigilance. They'd committed themselves now. There was no going back, no changing course. Everything depended on Harrison Blackwell receiving the telegram and taking appropriate action. "Do you think he'll help?" Thea asked as they sat by their small fire, eating a simple meal of dried meat and hardtack. "You know him better than I do," Cheveo replied. "But you said he was a man of principle. If that is true, he will at least investigate. And if he investigates, he will find the truth. And if he doesn't, if my uncle has already convinced him I'm unstable or lying, then we proceed with our original plan. We reach Prescott, we tell your story to the Territorial Marshal, and we hope that justice still exists somewhere in this territory." He looked at her across the fire. "But I believe your attorney will help. Good men do not stop being good just because it becomes inconvenient." They took turns keeping watch that night, neither willing to risk being caught unaware. During Thea's watch, she found herself studying Cheveo's sleeping form, noting the way even in sleep he remained alert, his hand resting on his knife. She wondered what it would be like to have a life with this man. To build something real in a world that would judge them harshly for choosing each other. The thought should have frightened her, but instead filled her with quiet determination. She'd already lost everything familiar, had already been forced to become someone new. Why not embrace that transformation completely? Why not choose a life that was honest and real, even if it was difficult? The second day brought the danger they'd been expecting. They were riding through a narrow pass when Chevio suddenly signaled for silence and steered his horse into a thick stand of juniper. Thea followed without question, and moments later she heard what had alerted him. The sound of multiple horses approaching from ahead. They dismounted and led their horses deeper into cover, then crept forward to observe. 6 men rode into view, all armed, all wearing the rough clothes of hired guns. Thea didn't recognize them, but Chevio's expression darkened. "Cord's men," he whispered. "I have seen 3 of them before, at his mining operations. They are searching the roads to Prescott, looking for anyone matching your description." The men stopped almost directly opposite their hiding place, one of them pulling out a canteen and taking a long drink. They seemed in no hurry to move on, discussing their search pattern in voices that carried clearly in the still air. "Cord's offering $1,000 for information leading to the girl," one of them said. "Dead or alive, though he prefers alive. Wants to make an example of her. Hell, for $1,000. I'd search every canyon between here and California," another replied. "Woman can't have gone far. She's probably holed up somewhere, scared and alone." Thea felt Chevio tense beside her, his hand tightening on his rifle. She placed her hand on his arm, shaking her head slightly. They couldn't risk a confrontation, not against 6 armed men. He looked at her, clearly torn between the desire to eliminate the threat and the practical need to remain hidden. The men finished their rest and eventually moved on, riding further down the trail. Chevio and Thea remained hidden for another 30 minutes, making absolutely sure they were gone before emerging from cover. "We cannot use the main trail," Chevio said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "They are watching it too closely. We must go cross-country, which will add time but keep us hidden." The cross-country route was punishing. They had to lead their horses across rocky terrain, through thick brush that tore at their clothes, up steep slopes that left both them and their mounts exhausted. What should have been a day's ride stretched into 2, and their food supplies ran dangerously low, but they saw no more of Cord's men, which made the hardship worthwhile. On the afternoon of the 4th day after leaving Pine Haven, they finally caught sight of Prescott in the distance. The territorial capital spread across a high valley, its buildings solid and substantial compared to the rough mining camps they'd passed. "We made it," Thea breathed, hardly daring to believe it. "Almost," Chevio corrected, his caution undiminished. "The town itself may be the most dangerous part. Cord has influence here too, though not as strong as in Copper Ridge. We must go directly to the marshal's office. Tell your story before anyone can stop us." They approached the town carefully, entering at dusk when the streets were busy enough to provide cover, but not so late that the marshal's office would be closed. Chevio led them through back streets, avoiding the main thoroughfares where they might be recognized. Finally, they dismounted in front of a sturdy stone building with a sign reading Territorial Marshal's Office. "This is where we part ways," Chevio said quietly. Thea turned to him, alarm flooding through her. "What? No, you're coming with me. I need you." He shook his head. "A Modoc warrior walking into the marshal's office with you will raise questions, create complications. Your story is stronger if you tell it alone, as a victim seeking justice, not as someone who has allied with the native the town fears." He touched her face gently. "I will be nearby watching. If anything goes wrong, I will know. But you must do this part alone." "Chevio," Thea started, her voice breaking. "You are strong enough for this," he said firmly. "You have always been strong enough. Now go, Tell your truth. Demand justice. And when it is over, when you are truly safe and free, I will be waiting for your answer." Before she could protest further, before she could tell him she'd already made her choice, he pressed something into her hand. She looked down to find a small carved stone, smooth and warm from his pocket, shaped like a bird in flight. "My sister made this," he said softly. "She gave it to me before she was taken, said it would bring me home safely from the war. It did. Now I give it to you for the same reason." Then he was gone, disappearing into the gathering dusk as silently as always, leaving Thea standing alone before the marshal's office with tears streaming down her face and a carved stone clutched in her hand. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. Cheveo was right. She was strong enough for this. She'd survived pursuit, committed sabotage, crossed dangerous territory, and fallen in love with a man her world would never accept. She could walk through a door and tell the truth. She climbed the steps and pushed open the door to the marshal's office. A middle-aged man with a salt and pepper beard looked up from his desk, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to sharp attention as he took in her travel-stained clothes and exhausted appearance. "I need help," Thea said, her voice stronger than she felt. "My name is Thea Shepard, and I have a story to tell about fraud, forgery, and attempted murder." The marshal stood slowly, his hand moving toward the gun at his hip. "Thea Shepard? There's a bulletin out about you. Says you're unstable, dangerous, that your family is worried sick. That bulletin is a lie," Thea said firmly. "And I can prove it. But first, I need you to send a telegram to San Francisco, to an attorney named Harrison Blackwell. He'll confirm everything I'm about to tell you." The marshal studied her for a long moment, his experienced eyes taking in details she wasn't even aware of showing. Finally, he gestured to a chair. "Sit down, Miss Shepard. Start from the beginning. And this better be good, because Silas Cord is a powerful man in this territory, and he's been looking for you for over a week." Thea sat, clutching the carved stone for courage, and began to speak. She told him everything: her father's death, her uncle's embezzlement, the forged marriage contract, her desperate flight, and the men who'd pursued her. She didn't mention Cheveo by name, referring to him only as someone who'd helped her reach safety. She described the evidence her father had kept, explained about Harrison Blackwell's files, detailed every crime her uncle and Silas Cord had committed. The marshal listened without interruption, making notes occasionally, his expression growing darker as her story unfolded. When she finally finished, he sat back in his chair and studied her with new respect. "That's quite a tale, Miss Shepard. And if even half of it is true, we've got some serious problems." He stood and moved to a telegraph key in the corner of the office. "I'm going to wire this Harrison Blackwell right now, see what he has to say. And I'm going to contact the U.S. Marshal's office in San Francisco, have them look into your uncle's activities. This is bigger than territorial jurisdiction." "Thank you," Thea said, feeling some of the tension leave her shoulders. "Thank you for listening. Don't thank me yet," the marshal warned. "If Cord gets wind that you're here, there'll be trouble. You'll need to stay somewhere safe until we sort this out." He paused. "There's a boarding house 2 streets over, run by a widow named Martha Chun. Good woman, discreet. I'll have a deputy escort you there and post a guard." As the marshal sent his telegrams and arranged for her protection, Thea found herself looking out the window into the darkening street, searching for any sign of Cheveo. She saw nothing, but she knew he was there, watching, making sure she was safe. The knowledge comforted her more than all the marshal's promises of protection. She'd taken the first step toward reclaiming her life and her freedom. Now she just had to survive long enough to see it through. 3 days passed in Martha Chun's boarding house, 3 days of waiting that stretched Thea's nerves to the breaking point. The widow's home was comfortable and well kept, with lace curtains and polished furniture that reminded Thea painfully of her San Francisco life. But comfort couldn't ease the anxiety that gnawed at her every waking moment. A deputy stood guard outside her door at all times, and she was forbidden from leaving the building. The marshal visited daily with updates. Harrison Blackwell had responded immediately to the telegram, confirming that the documents Marcus Shepard had sent him contained discrepancies with the originals in his files. He'd already contacted federal authorities and was preparing a full legal brief documenting the fraud. The U.S. Marshal's office in San Francisco had raided Marcus's home and office, seizing records and placing him under house arrest pending formal charges. But there was darker news as well. Silas Cord had learned of Thea's presence in Prescott and was reportedly riding toward the town with a dozen armed men. He was claiming that Thea had stolen valuable property from him and demanding she be turned over to his custody. The territorial marshal was refusing, but the situation was becoming increasingly tense. Cord's got lawyers too, Marshal Hayes told her on the third afternoon, his weathered face grave. They're making noise about jurisdiction, about his rights as an aggrieved party. The territorial governor is involved now, and there's pressure to resolve this quickly. Cord's got friends in high places. What does that mean for me? Thea asked, though she already suspected the answer. It means we need that evidence from San Francisco to arrive soon, before political pressure forces me to make a decision I don't want to make. He paused, choosing his words carefully. There's talk of compromise, of you agreeing to marry Cord in exchange for dropping all charges against your uncle. Some folks think that would be the cleanest solution. Never, Thea said flatly. I'd rather hang for theft than marry that man. That's what I told the governor's aide. Hayes replied with a slight smile. But they're going to keep pushing. Money and influence have a way of twisting justice, even here in Prescott. After he left, Thea stood at the window, staring out at the street below. She caught a glimpse of movement in the shadows across the way, a figure that might have been Cheveo, or might have been nothing at all. She hadn't seen him since that night at the marshal's office, but she felt his presence constantly, knew he was watching over her even now. That evening brought the confrontation she'd been dreading. Martha Chun knocked softly on her door, her usually calm face troubled. Miss Shepard, there's a man downstairs demanding to see you. Says his name is Silas Cord. The deputy told him no, but he's refusing to leave. Thea's blood ran cold, but she forced her voice to remain steady. Tell the deputy I'll see him. But only in the parlor with witnesses present. 5 minutes later, she descended the stairs to find Silas Cord standing in the boarding house parlor. His expensive suit and polished boots, a stark contrast to the homey surroundings. He was a large man in his 50s, with silver-streaked hair and cold gray eyes that assessed her like she was livestock at auction. The deputy stood by the door, hand resting on his pistol, while Martha Chun positioned herself near the fireplace. Her presence a silent statement of support. Miss Shepard, Cord said, his voice smooth and cultured. We finally meet properly. I've been quite concerned about you. Save your false concern, Thea replied, remaining near the stairs, ready to flee if necessary. We both know why you're here. Cord's expression hardened slightly. I'm here because you've caused considerable trouble and expense. Your uncle has been arrested because of your wild accusations. My mining operations have been sabotaged. And you've dragged my good name through the mud with tales of forced marriage and criminal conspiracy. Tales? Thea's voice rose despite her attempt to stay calm. I have evidence of everything. The forged documents, the embezzlement, your arrangement with my uncle. It's all documented. Evidence that will take months to sort through in court, Cord said, stepping closer. The deputy shifted slightly, a warning that made Cord stop. Evidence that will cost both of us dearly in legal fees and reputation. I'm proposing a simpler solution. You withdraw your accusations, marry me as originally agreed, and I'll see that your uncle is released with minimal consequences. You'll have wealth, position, everything a woman could want. Except freedom, Thea said quietly. Accept the right to choose my own life. Accept the dignity of being seen as a person rather than property. You speak of dignity, but you've been living in the wilderness with a savage, Cord sneered, dropping his cultured facade. The whole territory is talking about it, about how Marcus Shepard's niece ran off with a Modoc warrior. Your reputation is already destroyed. Marriage to me is the only way to salvage anything. My reputation was destroyed the moment my uncle decided to sell me to you, Thea shot back. And the man who helped me, the one you call savage, showed me more honor and respect in a few days than you've shown in your entire life. He gave me the choice you're trying to take away. Cord's face flushed with anger. I'm offering you one last chance to be reasonable. Refuse, and I'll make sure you regret it. I have resources you can't imagine. Connections that reach further than some territorial marshal's jurisdiction. You think Harrison Blackwell's evidence matters? I can tie this up in courts for years, bankrupt you with legal fees. Make sure you spend the rest of your life fighting battles you'll never win. Then that's how I'll spend my life, Thea said, drawing strength from the carved stone she kept in her pocket, from the knowledge that Chevio was somewhere nearby. Because I'd rather fight and lose than surrender to you. For a moment, pure rage twisted Cord's features, showing the brutality he usually kept hidden. Then he smoothed his expression and turned to the deputy. Make sure she understands the consequences of her stubbornness. When she changes her mind, and she will, I'll be at the Grand Hotel. He left, and Thea's legs nearly gave out with relief. Martha Chun hurried over, guiding her to a chair. You stood up to him beautifully, dear. Not many would have the courage. I'm terrified, Thea admitted, her hands shaking. He's right about his resources and connections. What if the evidence from San Francisco isn't enough? Then you keep fighting, Martha said firmly. Some things are worth any price. Your father understood that, and so do you. That night, Thea couldn't sleep. She paced her room, alternating between hope and despair. Around midnight, a soft tapping at her window made her freeze. She pulled back the curtain to find Chevio perched on the narrow ledge outside. Having somehow climbed the building's exterior, she opened the window quickly, and he slipped inside with liquid grace. You shouldn't be here, she whispered urgently. If the deputy finds you, he is asleep at his post, Chevio said quietly. I watched him for an hour before climbing. We do not have much time. He studied her face in the moonlight. I saw Cord enter earlier. What did he want? To threaten me, to try to force me into marriage. Thea found herself moving closer to him, drawn by his solid presence. He said he'd destroy me in the courts, drag this out for years. He is afraid, Chevio observed. Men like him only make threats when they fear losing. Your evidence is stronger than he wants you to believe. How do you know that? Because I have been watching, listening. The marshal received another telegram tonight from the federal authorities. They have found evidence of worse crimes than fraud, connections between Cord and several suspicious deaths, including his previous wife and a business partner who opposed him. The investigation is expanding beyond your case, hope surged in Thea's chest. Then he might actually face justice, if he does not run first, Chevio said. Men like Cord, when cornered, they become dangerous. You must be very careful until this is resolved. He reached out and touched her face gently. I wanted to see you, to make sure you were well, and to tell you that whatever happens, you have already won the most important battle. What battle is that? The battle for yourself, he said simply. You chose freedom over safety, truth over comfort. You became who you were meant to be, not who others tried to make you. That victory, no court can take away. Thea caught his hand, holding it against her cheek. When this is over, I'm going to give you my answer. The one you said to wait for, and what will that answer be? He asked softly. You'll have to wait and find out, she said, managing a slight smile despite everything. But I think you already know. Something warm and tender crossed Chivio's face. I should go before I am discovered. But know this, Thea Shepherd. Whatever your answer, whatever you choose, I will respect it. Your freedom to choose is worth more than my desire for you to choose me. He moved to the window, paused, then turned back and kissed her forehead gently. Be strong a little longer. The end is near. Then he was gone, disappearing into the night as silently as he'd come, leaving Thea with warmth spreading through her chest and renewed determination in her heart. The next morning brought the news that changed everything. Marshal Hayes arrived at the boarding house shortly after dawn, his expression a mixture of satisfaction and concern. It's over, he said without preamble. Federal marshals arrived last night with arrest warrants for Silas Cord. They got him at his hotel before he could run. He's being transported to San Francisco to face charges for murder, fraud, and half a dozen other crimes. Thea sank into a chair, barely able to process the information. It's really over? The immediate danger is, Hayes confirmed. Your uncle is already in custody in San Francisco. The federal prosecutors say they have enough evidence to convict both men. Your testimony will be important, but the documentary evidence is solid. He paused. There's one complication, though. What complication? Thea asked warily. There's a federal judge coming to take depositions, wants to hear your full story directly. He'll be here in 2 days. Until then, you need to stay under protection. Cord's men are still in the territory, and they might try something desperate. The next 2 days were the longest of Thea's life. She gave her statement to the federal judge, a stern man who listened with careful attention and asked pointed questions that demonstrated his legal acumen. He seemed satisfied with her testimony and promised that justice would be served. Though the legal process would take time, your father's estate will be restored to you, he told her. The shipping business, the properties in San Francisco, everything your uncle stole. It will take several months to untangle the financial fraud, but you'll get back what's rightfully yours. The news should have brought joy, but instead Thea felt oddly disconnected. The life she'd fought so hard to reclaim suddenly seemed less appealing than it once had. The thought of returning to San Francisco, to society parties and business meetings, filled her with a strange restlessness. On the evening of the second day, after the judge had departed and the immediate legal matters were concluded, Thea finally received permission to leave the boarding house. The deputy escort offered to accompany her, but she politely declined, saying she just wanted to walk and clear her head. She made her way through Prescott streets as the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Without conscious decision, she found herself walking toward the edge of town, toward the scrub-covered hills that marked the beginning of the wilderness. And there, sitting on a flat rock overlooking the valley, she found Chevio. He looked up as she approached, a slight smile crossing his face. I thought you might come here eventually. How did you know? She asked, settling beside him on the rock. Because this is where someone goes when they need to make an important decision, he said. Away from the noise and pressure of the town, back to the land where things are clear. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the last light fade from the sky. Thea thought about everything that had happened, about the girl she'd been and the woman she'd become, about the life that waited for her in San Francisco and the life she could choose instead. The judge says I'll inherit my father's business, she said finally. Everything my uncle stole, it's all coming back to me. I'll be wealthy, independent, able to live however I choose. That is good news, Chevio said neutrally. Your father would be pleased, would he though? Thea asked. I've been thinking about that. My father valued integrity over wealth, principles over profit. He built his business honestly, but he also knew when to walk away from opportunities that compromised his values. She turned to look at Chevio. I think he'd understand if I chose a different path. What path is that? Chevio asked, though his eyes suggested he knew. I could sell the business, Thea said slowly, working through her thoughts out loud. Keep enough to live comfortably, but let someone else run the day-to-day operations. I could use the money to do something meaningful, something that would honor my father's principles. Maybe fund schools in the territories, or support legal aid for people fighting against men like Cord. Maybe work to protect the land and water from mining operations that poison everything they touch. Those are worthy goals, Chevallo said. But where would you do this work? Wherever it's needed most, Thea replied. Wherever I could make a real difference. Maybe in the territories where the land is still beautiful and worth fighting for. Where there are people who still believe in honor and keeping their word. It would be a hard life, Chevallo warned, echoing his words from days before. Harder than San Francisco society, I know, Thea said. But it would be real. It would be true. It would be chosen. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the carved stone bird he'd given her. You said when this was over, when I was truly free to choose, you'd give me an honest answer. I'm free now, Chevallo. Freer than I've ever been. So I'm asking, will you let me choose you? Will you let me build this new life beside you? For a long moment, Chevallo didn't speak. When he finally did, his voice was rough with emotion. You would give up everything for this, for me? I'm not giving up anything, Thea corrected. I'm choosing what matters. I'm choosing honesty over pretense, real connection over society's approval, a life of meaning over a life of comfort. And yes, I'm choosing you. Because you see me as I truly am and value me for it. Because you gave me back my freedom and then trusted me to use it wisely. Because I love you. The last words came out in a rush, surprising even her with their intensity. Chevallo's eyes widened, and for the first time since she'd met him, he looked genuinely uncertain. Thea, he said softly, I am not an easy man. I carry anger at what has been done to my people. I live by old ways in a world that is changing. I cannot promise you comfort or safety or acceptance by your people or mine. I'm not asking for any of that, Thea interrupted. I'm asking if you love me. Everything else we can figure out together. Chevallo reached out and cupped her face in both hands, his touch gentle despite his calloused palms. I love you, he said, the words carrying the weight of absolute truth. From the moment you admitted you were scared but chose to trust me anyway, I have loved you. I tried not to. Tried to keep distance, but you made it impossible. You are brave and fierce and honest, everything I value most. Then he kissed her, and it was nothing like the chaste kiss on her forehead from before. This kiss was deep and claiming, a promise and a beginning. Thea melted into it, into him, feeling like she'd finally come home after a long journey. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Chevallo rested his forehead against hers. Are you certain? Once this choice is made, once we walk this path together, there is no easy turning back. I'm certain, Thea said firmly. More certain than I've ever been about anything. Then I will stand beside you, Chevallo said. In this work you plan, in this life you choose. We will protect the land together, fight injustice together, build something that honors both your father's principles and my people's ways. It will not be easy. Nothing worth having ever is, Thea replied, echoing something her father used to say. But it will be ours. Real and true and chosen. They sat together on that rock as the stars emerged overhead, making plans for a future neither had expected, but both now embraced. They would return to San Francisco briefly so Thea could settle her father's estate and make arrangements for the business. Then they would come back to the territories, buy land near the Modoc settlements, and establish a legal practice dedicated to defending native rights and environmental protections. It would be controversial, difficult, dangerous even. They would face prejudice from both their peoples, opposition from powerful interests. But they would face it together, building a life based on shared values and genuine love. I should have been more afraid of you, Thea said eventually, a smile playing at her lips. Everyone warned me about the dangerous Modoc warrior, and instead I should have been more afraid of you, Chaveo replied with rare humor. The proper San Francisco lady who turned out to be fiercer than any warrior I have known. They laughed together, the sound carrying across the quiet hills, a declaration of joy and defiance. Tomorrow they would begin the practical work of building their new life. But tonight, they simply sat together under the stars. Two people who had found each other against all odds, and chosen to be brave enough to love. Months later, standing in the office they'd established in a small territorial town. With legal documents spread across the desk and plans for water rights protection taking shape. Thea would remember that evening on the rock. She would remember being scared and choosing trust anyway. Running toward danger instead of safety, embracing uncertainty over false security. And she would know, with absolute certainty, that every difficult choice had been worth it. Because she'd found something most people spent their whole lives searching for, a love built on respect and honesty, a purpose that gave meaning to every day, and the freedom to be exactly who she was meant to be. The girl who'd run through the Arizona desert in fear had become a woman who walked with confidence beside a man who'd proved himself worth believing in. And together, they were writing a story that no one could have predicted, but that felt, in every way that mattered, absolutely right.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.